Hi. A big thank you to the recordings of Nina Simone that we were just listening to. Welcome to Seen and Heard. I'm Amelia Bensusan, Artistic Director of Hartford Stage, and very excited about this week's episode as we'll be sharing a, a thrilling new collaboration for us at Hartford Stage and something that feels more relevant every day as we think about our future, the future of our city, and what matters to us in this country at this time, or what I hope matters to us at this country at this time. So first, I just need to do an enormous thank you to the Roberts Foundation for supporting Hartford Stage and specifically Seen and Heard. They've become our sponsors this season, and thank you to the Edward C. and Ann T. Roberts Foundation. For those of you who've joined us before, we often start with an excerpt from a play. We read a scene, and we've had guests from University of Hartford. The wonderful BFA acting students have read for us, and we've had local actors and folks from around the country join us for readings. Originally today, we were thinking of broadcasting an excerpt from one of the most famous radio plays of all time in my mind, and that's Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, which was so impactful because people thought it was news. Of course, in our moment, the news is so impactful that to do a piece about aliens invading almost seems anticlimactic given the importance of all that's happening in our country at this moment. So we've opted not to start with an excerpt from a play, and instead I'm going to, as soon as possible, which is to say really right now, invite our guests so we can jump into a conversation about a new collaboration where Hartford Stage with Connecticut Public Broadcasting and University of Connecticut's Oral History Project will be creating radio plays. So let me now welcome these extraordinary folks who will be talking with me about this this new initiative, as well as about what's on their minds today and how Hartford plays on the national scene on all these topics, and how Hartford Stage can matter more, as well as Connecticut Public Broadcasting and artists and University of Connecticut centers. So first, let me welcome Dr. Fiona Vernal, Director of EPOC, which stands for Engaged Public Oral and Community Histories at UConn. Fiona's history with Hartford Stage goes back to 2018, when she was part of our Sunday Speakers series during a production of Atul Fugard's A Lesson from Aloes. And then she returned in 2019 to partner during the production of Dominique Morisseau's Detroit 67. In the chat, you're going to see links to Fiona's work. I encourage you to follow them. And Fiona, please come join me. I'm just thrilled for this partnership and to begin a relationship for me, although your relationship with Hartford Stage clearly precedes my presence here. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Oh, it's so exciting. I'm just so happy about all this. I'm so grateful that this is our conversation today. So next, I am going to welcome Tim Rasmussen. And even though our last names share many consonants, our ancestry does not, which cracks me up to a certain degree, Tim, although maybe that's really off the point. Tim is the Chief Content Officer at Connecticut Public Broadcasting. Please join us, Tim. You've only been at Connecticut Public Broadcasting in this position almost as long as I've been at Hartford Stage. We're both new to these positions, and I really treasure our collaboration already. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This is fabulous.
It's really fun, right? I mean, we're all a little tired of Zoom, and yet this has its moments. So I really thank you all. And lastly, let me invite our first commissioned playwright for this new initiative, my friend Michael J. Bobbitt. He's a writer, he's a director, he's a choreographer, although you're probably living choreography as well. And most recently, and kind of like blew my mind, but felt absolutely right, is the director of the Massachusetts Cultural Council. So he's gone from running theaters to being an artist at various theaters, running a very successful children's theater, moving to Boston, running a theater here, really transforming the Boston theater scene in his 18 months as artistic director. And now we're excited not only about you championing the artists at the Massachusetts Cultural Council, but being our first commissioned playwright. So,
I'm so excited. I even wore my playwriting glasses.
oh, I'm glad you wore your playwriting glasses. I've lost my director hat. It's somewhere here, but I'm hoping when the pandemic lifts, I'll find it again. Welcome all. Thank you so much for being here. And for those of you watching at home on your various devices, please remember we welcome your comments in the chat. We welcome your questions. We expect this to be a free-ranging conversation and want your voice to be a part of it. So share your thoughts, whatever they may be, as we begin this conversation. So I'm going to throw out just a very general question to each of you, and then we'll have as freewheeling a conversation as one can have on Zoom. Radio plays and this project. What is this project from each of your perspectives? Right, we're sort of jumping in. I described it a bit in my Seen and Heard for those of you who read it. That was that came out on Saturday. But what to your minds is this project, and why does it matter? So, Fiona, can I start with you? Since you and I talked about this early on.
Yes. So for me, this is an opportunity to raise, lift, promote, enhance the voices of people that we don't normally hear from. I think one of the conversations that's happening all across the country, all in schools about what's going on in our curriculum is how can we tell new stories about the contributions that people have made to this country? How do we tell stories about our homes? How do we tell stories about our cities? And for me, this is a really important opportunity to insert some of those voices into the usual narratives. And oral histories have always been a way for me to do that. And people talk about, everything from what was it like to be a West Indian immigrant and experience snow for the first time, or what it was like, as an African-American person, like working in the tobacco fields, what it was like to hear a West Indian accent for the first time, or to encounter people who come from another place. And those stories matter, right? Those stories absolutely matter. They've been fun, they've been exciting, they've been poignant. They've introduced me to Hartford's history. And so I'm hoping that this project will do a little bit of that as well.
Can you just share for a moment how your new center, right? Your new center operates and how you're collecting stories?
And so the University of Connecticut is deeply committed to putting the university in the service of the broader community, including Hartford, the broader community, the broader national community. And so we started a new initiative, Engaged Public Oral and Community History, to capture what that commitment could look like. We would like to partner with community organizations, social organizations, to sort of take a look at what their archives look like. And if they don't have a formal archive, to help them build one based on the stories that the people in those organizations can tell about the origins of those social organizations, those community-based organizations. And then we hope to lend our expertise, lend our resources to help them tell their stories in the spaces where they want those stories, told.
Was such a perfect fit with us, right? I mean, just to hear you describe it, it's a version of what we want to do with theater as well, right? A
Absolutely.
different iteration, but very much to the core. Tim Rasmussen, your connection to this project, and what does this project say to you in Connecticut Public Broadcasting?
I think for me, I spent a career like telling other people's stories through their own words, right? So as a photojournalist, I was always did my own interviews and talked to people, what resonates always is the stories of us as humans across those spectrums, right? And thinking about how that deeply human story of each individual can interconnect, and that's what makes us a society. It isn't a piece of paper. It isn't what we believe. It's that we can connect that way. So, this idea and telling stories in multiple different formats and getting to people in different ways and finding a voice that somebody might relate to in a different way is really what we try to do. And so at Connecticut Public, we really take the mission, right? The mission of Connecticut Public is to represent and to report on our community at large and be the most relevant journalism organization in the state for the people of the state. If you really believe that, which I do, you really have to go out there and find different ways to get to different people. And that's one of the missions. So when this came up, I don't think I hesitated at all.
You were awesome. When I said, what about broadcasting radio plays from Hartford Stage? You just said yes. And I was like, okay, my new favorite person,
And Katie Tolarski, who's our senior director for storytelling, and I gave her that title and I came here, she kind of shook her head at me a little bit and like, what does that mean? And I said, storytelling is everything we do, right? So how do we interface that? How do we do it differently? Right. She's brilliant at that. And so like how we craft these stories will be great. And do we get to a different audience? Do we find different ways? So not only on air, but in all these different platforms that we have extended out our reach to, and can we get to communities where they are in a way that they hadn't thought about something before?
It's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I yes, absolutely. The great thing about Zoom is people unmute and they're ready. So, Michael, what do you think about radio plays for family listening and these collaborations? And
yeah, well,
tell us about your role in all this.
Sure, I'll answer what Dr. Vernal said, that I'm fascinated by all the stories. She sent me a half a dozen interviews, and they were just fascinating people with
so can I back up a moment to inform folks, and then we'll come right back to you? So the notion of this project is very much that we commission gifted playwrights like Michael from a variety of backgrounds that reflect the groups that have recorded oral histories with Fiona's project and have been the founding forces in this region. So the great thrill for all of us is that we take, thanks to Fiona, these stories, we send them to a playwright and say, make something up. But here, right? I mean, you have free reign as a creative artist, but we ask you to think about the ethnicity you're researching and key points within the anecdotes, the narratives that you're hearing, and how those transform into short radio plays for family listening that will be broadcast on our website and Connecticut Public Broadcasting, more importantly. So now I just needed to give you that setup, Michael.
Yeah, so the first challenge was, which of the stories that I was fascinated by and fell in love with do I pick? Yeah. Which one spoke to me the most? So that was the first hard challenge. Mm. And the second challenge, I will say that, Milia, this is one of the hardest projects I've ever done.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
But I mean, one of the things I'm blessed with is creativity. And so I like that challenge. And, I've written full-length musicals, I've written full-length plays, I've written short plays. I've adapted major brands like Garfield and Bob Marley into plays. But this is like really hard.
Why is it so hard, Michael?
Partly because there are so many. One, they're based on real life people, and so there are some moments in their stories that I'm just deeply fascinated by. And how do you turn that into a theatrical piece is, I think, the hardest part. In
Right.
addition to turning into a theatrical piece and trying to reduce these wonderful stories into a 15-minute play, now you have to translate it into radio.
Right.
You know, live theater, we had the chance to see the artists, to see their faces, to see their emotion. Now we're filling in the blank just based on their voices. So I have to write a different way. And again, there were so many fascinating things. I mean, there was the flood that the person I'm writing on went through, moving from living in impoverished housing to moving into one of the country's first housing projects. And
All
what that
within
felt
Hartford,
like.
right? This is
Yeah,
all Hartford history.
all Hartford history. And so, and then in addition to the information I got in the interview that Dr. Bernal sent me, doing my own research on Hartford and Connecticut, I mean, there were lots of stories about her family moving from the South, the Jim Crow South, coming to the North, hoping for this world free of racism,
Right.
but finding still racism that exists. So it's just this wonderfully hard project. And then you throw on top of that family audiences. So that little extra layer has been a bit of a challenge, but I'm having a blast working on it.
What personally connects you to the material? Sorry, I silenced the computer, but not the phone. So it's my daughter calling. I'm sure everything's fine. Never mind.
Yeah,
We know, we all, since
I-
Tim talked about his 18-year-old, and I know Michael has a 19-year-old, I feel comfortable saying it's my 21-year-old calling.
I blocked him last night. He was pestering me about a PS something or another, so I just blocked
All
him.
right, fair enough.
Yeah, that works.
Let's-
Okay.
So what do you feel personal connections to this material, or is that maybe not a necessary question, not a necessary aspect for you to create a piece, or is it? I mean, that would be my
I do. And this is not my first bio play, and I think we're going to be switching it up a little bit, inspired by, but not specifically on the person I'm writing on. But I have to find some emotional connection. So the person I'm writing about reminds me of my mom and my grandma and some of the young ladies that were in the neighborhoods that I grew up in. And so I just felt this really great personal connection of her story, and that's what pulled me into it. And so now I got to figure out how to. There's a draft. I'm working on a new draft based on our note session.
we had a great conversation about this, so that
We
was
did.
really
We
fun.
did. There was one little fictional moment that I created that you seem to like a lot of. So
I
that's gonna
loved. So
that's going to be the thing that glues it all together. So I'm kind of excited about it.
Fiona, you helped us sort of shape the outreach, the first wave of commissions on this project based on the 6 groups that you told us, which was news to me, were most influential or were the largest immigrant groups to form our region. Can you talk about that? Because that's very much where Michael's commission comes in and where our next few commissions, which we're almost ready to announce, will be coming in.
Well, for those of us who know contemporary Hartford, right, there is a really fascinating story about how the city turned out to be the way that it is, right? If you say, pick a year, 1940, Hartford didn't look like this. There were just a handful of West Indians, for example, here in the 1940s. And now in the state of Connecticut, West Indians are the largest foreign-born population. Hartford's on the map as having the 3rd largest Jamaican community in the United States. And that origin story needs to be told. And then I think we're also familiar with contemporary Hartford in terms of its particular neighborhoods and how its neighborhoods turned out to be the way that it is, whether that's the Upper Albany neighborhood, the Clay Arsenal neighborhood, whether that's Parkville. And when you think about, like, how is it that Canadians came to be centered where they are?
Right, that was a surprise to me. French Canadians, right?
French Canadians, or the Portuguese community, and how do is culture portable? When people move here from another place, which parts of their culture is portable? Which part of their culture is translatable? What do they really try to hold on to? And we are all familiar with the fact that that's a lot of like music and food. And so I thought it was really important for us to frame all of these histories using one lens. How did Hartford become home, right? And by extension, we could ask that of any other place in the United States. And what did home mean for West Indians who are coming here in the middle of the war versus World War II versus West Indians who are coming here after 65, like after immigration policy is more liberalized. And this is a great opportunity for us to ask those origin questions and to come up with a framework where we can talk about French Canadians and Portuguese and West Indian
Right.
communities, all using one analytical framework. It's absolutely fascinating. And most importantly, just so much fun, right?
Yeah,
All these
agreed.
people who are growing up in Hartford and talking about going skating in the park or going swimming in the parks, and you realize that there are just so many more things that connect us than divide us. And the way that people have experienced the city of Hartford is one of those things that connects us.
It's wonderful. And also, right, the African American community in Hartford, which you mentioned, a large percentage, their ancestors or their elders came from Georgia. Yeah, it's.
Yes. So by 1930, 40% of the population, of the African American population, has their ancestries is Georgian.
Which is
right?
so, you're right, not necessarily
And
right.
that's
what we
not
would know.
something that's known anecdotally in the community, and it gets us to ask new questions about African American history, like why Georgia and the different hubs of the Great Migration. Of all the different hubs of the Great Migration, why did the Georgia one sort of land in Hartford
Right,
in the
right,
way
right.
that it did? And it gets us also to understand diversity within the African American community. So one of the key questions as well is like, why is it, if you look at the census records and you look at, say, the deeds at the city clerk's office, it turns out that a significant proportion of the folks who were considered very well off in Hartford were from Virginia. Right. And we have to ask those historical questions. Like, we understand that people were on the move. We understand that 6 million African Americans were on the move between 1915 and 1970, but they're deeper questions for us to ask, and deeper questions that connect the Great Migration to Hartford.
To
And Georgia,
Hartford, right? And
yeah,
specific stories.
yes.
And also the Puerto Rican and Dominican communities, which we're also celebrating through this project, right? It the idea was very much, as I hand this over to Tim, right, was thinking about, during a pandemic, different ways of storytelling. We at Hartford Stage pride ourselves on, of course, that's what we do. We're storytellers. And what platform can we use when our stage is shuttered? But as we talked about it, it sort of grew and grew in its dimensions, and it seemed like something that we should do regardless. So we're excited to begin during a pandemic and hopefully continue. One of my thoughts on this is access, right? Because these are meant for family listening, and we don't always get the families at Hartford Stage. It's hard to get to the theater. And there's also, there are, as we all know, so many issues around entitlement of who is supposed to be in the building and who can come into the building. And as much as we want to welcome everybody into our building, folks may not feel comfortable coming to us. They might not know what we do. And radio seems to me an enormously democratic tool, still a source of voice and art that is more readily accessible than almost any other format, right? So it made sense. I mean, radio drama, Tim, I'm sure you know all this, right? But was on the radio and was an enormous uh, an enormous part of our culture through the 20s and 30s in this country, right? I mean,
it might have been the original true democratic tool, right? You didn't have to buy it. Somebody has a radio, you can share it.
right.
You know, an old newspaper man, but you know, maybe you didn't have to pay a nickel or a quarter or $2.
Right. Whereas if you have the radio in your, you know, or someone in your neighborhood has a radio, you can gather around and hear a story. So
It's funny because you know the first radio drama I ever heard was War of the Worlds.
all right, did you didn't hear that like because it's live?
Not live, but if I did, I would be really looking good. No, not live.
Because I was gonna say you look good.
Thank you very much.
I'll
my
have what he's
father-
having if that's
My father had listened to it live, and he bought a tape of it when I was in junior high school, and he didn't tell me.
Oh,
He didn't tell me that it was Orson Welles. I didn't know it. And he sat me down and he let me listen to it. And I thought the thing was real.
so you bought it?
I bought it totally all in. And then I took the tape to junior high school and I played it for a whole bunch of people too. You know, I started a conspiracy theory about aliens landing in New Jersey in 1975.
In Utah. In Utah, no less. Yeah.
Well, you know, where I grew up, there's a lot of aliens out there. But yeah, so I really understood that power of the narrative and the story. And even thinking about when we went to video and newspapers, I would have photographers sit in rooms, close their eyes and listen to public radio like This American Life and hear the story, right? And you know, growing up in theater, and I did a lot of plays, and I understand that the narrative and how that voice can capture and transform emotion, you know, not necessarily always in the visual way. I'm a visual journalist, but not necessarily always in the visual way. So when you and I were talking initially, I could see and hear what we were talking about. I mean, you and I took it to all sorts of places, including animation and all other things. But the reality is, the devices by which people would be able to consume this today, right? Cassette tape in junior high, the 70s versus, you know, iPhones and, you know, games. So like we have what we call a digital services bureau led by a guy named Jake Volschkel, and it's really cool. And Lauren Komorowski, they have extended our reach to places like Twitch. And how do you get to where kids are playing video games?
I don't know what Twitch. I've never heard of Twitch.
My 18-year-old told me all about it. But you know, so to places where our content, which is meant for over-the-air public radio and an audience, can we get to other places where other audiences are? And we're experimenting with that. And what does that sound like? And what does that do? So when we get into this project, you know, how do we get them into Instagram? How do we get them into other places? We know where our audience is, but if you want to bring in new audiences, you kind of got to go to where they are. Right. The same with the theater, and how do we take this thing that we all love, right? Obviously we're all here. And how do you get it to people in a different way and get them to love it? The way my father did with, you know, frankly, with War of the Worlds.
It's wonderful. Michael, I've heard you speak about, I was just going to ask you, because I've heard you speak about why theater for intergenerational audiences matters, but now specifically sort of how radio theater matters. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, you know, first of all, for intergenerational theater and theater for young people, if we want to have great artists, theatrical artists, or longtime patrons of the arts, we got to get them when they're young. We have to brainwash them with this amazing art form and like make sure they see it again and again and again so that we can have this art form. But I think what Tim is talking about adds another layer of complexity to this fantastic project, that I want to pay homage to the art form of radio plays, but then meet the kids, because it's family, right? Meet the kids where they are. And they all grew up with little computers in their pockets. And so their ability to absorb a lot of stimulus at the same time is far advanced than we older people. And so how do you get both at the same time without alienating one audience or the other? You know, I was saying when I wrote for children, in theater, every single joke had to work on two levels. Like you couldn't do something that was just for the kids because the parents would roll their eyes, and or you
Right.
couldn't do something for the parents because if the parent laughed and the kid didn't get it, then the kid would come out of the play, turn to their parent and say,
Hating
"Why are
it.
you
Yeah.
laughing?"
Yeah, that's
So
nasty, right?
yeah, and so it's a really interesting challenge that I'm sort of working on and churning around in my head and on paper, but it's very, very exciting.
How is it different to create a radio play than to be stage play? I mean, we know the obvious things. You're not writing
Yeah.
stage
So
directions or wondering about the set, I hope.
yeah,
No
right.
budget for a set
No
designer.
budget for a set designer.
Yeah. But
So
yeah.
yeah, so the I mean, like when you're writing for film, the actor's head can be like 23 feet tall. So their subtle movement or one word and the way they act can tell a lot, or what's happening off screen can tell a lot, or the camera is moving every 3 or 4 seconds can helping to make the emotional churn of the play happen, or the story happen. When you're writing for a book, the language that you're using is helping the reader fill in the blanks and color the scenery and let them know where they are. And then there's a relationship between the reader and the writer that is different for every person. There's something about the radio play because the language has to be colorful enough to help them see where the person in the play is, fill in the blank, and then there's all the oral stuff you can do, the sort of Foley, we called it Foley back then,
Right.
the Foley sounds that you can create without like these long drawn out scenes. Plus, I'm also trying to tell these people's full story in about 15 minutes, which so shorthand storytelling is compressed, but it's a hard little challenge, and it's I'm pulling my hair out.
Sorry to contribute to that particular aspect.
Can I say something?
I also wanted to say, I just want to say also, I was so excited about the Jamaican in the West Indies story because I wrote a Bob Marley children's musical. And so I know that culture a lot. So I was really fascinated, but I'm glad you convinced me to write the story that I actually lived, which is my family migrated from the South to the North. They stopped in DC and Maryland, but they had that similar migration story and integrating into a community that they thought was supposed to be anti-racist, but learned that it was as racist in many ways as the South.
Of where they come from.
Yep.
Fiona, you were gonna, thank you so much, Michael. Yes, Fiona.
No, I just wanted to say that, you know, like Michael, you look like you pulled all of your hair out, so no more hair pulling. But
I was being polite.
and you know, I have the same kind of problem when I'm trying to figure out how to go from an oral history transcript to an exhibition where I might have, you know, 500 words and some visual elements to try to capture the essence of that oral history, because in a lot of ways, right, our audiences are not necessarily going to step into a library and read a 63-page oral history transcript or listen to a 2 or 3 hour interview. And so we have to think about all the different ways different kinds of audiences
right.
are going to engage this material. But it's also an exciting opportunity, right, to say, like, if you're a photographer, right, that the deliverable can look like something else. If you're a playwright, it can look like something else. If you're developing an exhibition, if you're developing,
You're
doing
creating narratives, right? I mean, you're
Right.
really creating a narrative from the material.
Yeah,
And
and I think for our young
focus.
audiences, it's really important to let them see all of the different ways in which they can tell stories. So I just wanted to say that.
No,
And
it's awesome. How do you
Actually-
oh, sorry, Tim, go
I was
ahead.
just gonna say, and that's actually the power of the moment that we're in a lot of ways too, right? So not only in the auditorial way here, but like all of these different formats we're talking about storytelling, and there's a lot of power in how these stories can be told differently. And I think that's, for me, that's the really exciting part about how the world kind of shifted and changed, and how it continues to change, especially with young people finding different ways to get a hold of those narratives.
Well, that seems so important, right? I mean, that's why these are made, commissioned, and in partnership with all of you, made for family listening, because we do want to inspire both, uh, a desire to learn more about one's own history or each other's histories, and as well as just the glory of listening to good stories, right? Go ahead,
Yeah,
Fiona.
I
Yeah.
also, in the particular moment that we are in with the verdict, I think for all of us who tuned in, we also get to see the power of story and the power of narrative, right? Because in order to get to this particular verdict, we had to see George Floyd as a human being, and we had to see him as a father, and we got to discuss him as a baby. Right.
Right.
We get to have these alternative narratives so that the only picture that we're left of him is not the one at the tragic end of his life, but all of the other stories that his family wants out there about him. And I think we have to really claim this moment and try to tell as many stories in as many different venues, in as many different formats as we can, so that we can empower young people to say, all right, maybe I'm going to do it through poetry, maybe I'm going to do it through photography, but I have a voice and I can share stories of my community and my family and my country, stories that I author, stories that comes from my voices and my contributions and my perspective.
It's wonderful. And controlling the narrative is really important. Being able to shape what the story is that people hear about us or we hear about each other is crucial. I really appreciate what you're saying here on that.
And I also think that if you're not careful, right, that story could have went the other way, right? His deeply human story that we got to know because nobody was not going to let us not listen. And I know that isn't proper grammar there. I just said that wrong, but no one was not going to let us listen to it. His story was not going to get forgotten. And I think when you talk about home, right, that we frame this around home, you have to think about how each person, each human, each citizen, each connected person has a connection to a home, right? And you find out what that is really by when people are refused to accept something as horrific of what we saw in Minneapolis.
Yeah, and I also that idea of controlling the narrative and being responsible with the narrative so that it's authentically told and truthfully told. I was working on a series of plays at the Smithsonian where we took sort of museum-worthy topics and turned them into plays. And one of the series we wrote was called "The Greatest Stories Never Told." And these are Black history stories that were left out of the history books or retold from a white perspective. So, for example, what we learned was Jackie Robinson was the first Black man to break the color barrier. And the narrative was that he was exceptional. He was better than everyone else. He was so good that he got to play in the major leagues, which is not true. When we look at the stats of his ball playing and other Black ball players, he was average. He was okay, but he was the first Black person allowed by whites to play in the major leagues. The other story that many people don't know is the story of Rosa Parks and the Alabama bus boycott, the Birmingham bus boycott. This happened to a young, dark-skinned, pregnant teenager about 8 months prior to that date. And Rosa Parks was her senior advisor in the NAACP. The NAACP decided that this young lady, because she was dark-skinned, because she was pregnant and a teenager, wasn't going to be the best person to represent the Black.
Right. They wanted a different story to achieve more success.
Right. Yeah. So that date that Rosa Parks decided to not give up her seat was planned by the NAACP. Right. But that's not the narrative that we got in the history books. So that's the other sort of interesting challenge about these stories. We're gonna turn them into inspired by and have fun playing with it. But how do you sort of make sure that they are still authentic?
But isn't that the challenge, right? In journalism, there's a big conversation going on. There's always a conversation going on, but there's a big conversation going on over fairness versus objectivity and these foundational journalistic ideals, right? They're not rules, they're ideals, let's be honest. But, you know, and I was having a great conversation a few weeks ago with a former colleague who I idolize in a lot of ways, and just great editor. And we were talking about objectivity versus fairness, and how fairness should be the governance of what we try to do. And I thought that for a long time about not just in journalism, but in life in general, right? Fairness is a really interesting concept. But when you think about how a story is told and how a narrative like Rosa Parks gets changed in order for it to be successful, how do we make sure that what we're telling their stories in fairness, right? Like that we're telling the story of Hartford or home and through the people that lived it, and making sure that their voices are the ones that are heard.
It's so moving actually to hear all three of you, because as you're speaking, I feel why this project, I mean, forgive the selfishness of bringing Hartford Stage want to get into this, but I feel like what the three of you are saying speaks exactly to the point of this project, right? That we're taking history and transforming it through artistry. It's not factual. It's inspired by the truth, but not a slave to it, and can create its own sort of fulsome narrative in a different fashion, right? To be listened to be digested through different lenses, depending on your age, depending on if you're hearing about your background or you're hearing about a neighbor's background. I mean, there's just a lot of ways to digest and then reinvent yourself by hearing these stories, because that's part of, right? It's both how people respond to the narrative of your life and both how you see your own life based on the narratives you hear.
No, I think it's also a really important space for imagination, right? Young people are involved in really important efforts to bring about the world that they want. And that requires really courageous, bold acts of imagination. That world does not exist yet, whether it's around climate justice and social justice or other issues. And if the world isn't the way that you want it to be, it is so important that they're able to imagine that.
Right.
And that's what theater does.
And that everything's open, that if you can imagine a story, it can become the story you want, you know, that you want either for yourself or for each other. Yeah, Michael.
Favorite audiences, children audiences. Favorite, bar none. I just love writing for children because they have a freedom, and their response to the material is visceral. One, they will let you know when they're bored and not engaged, like right away. Right. They get the wiggles. They want to go to the bathroom. They will huff and yawn. But they also like, you know, I just think about what theater has become. It's become sort of quiet and
I know.
Still, right. And you think about
passive. It's become
right.
passive as opposed to
interactive. It was never back in the Greek and the Shakespeare days, and
it's
even
the fault of electricity.
Yeah,
right? We know this. I mean, the minute electricity shut everybody in and put them in the dark, then everyone was allowed to sort of check out, as opposed to connect.
Even in Latinx and in African traditional storytelling theatrical techniques, it was always interactive and meant to be explosive and you know, again, interactive. And so that's why I just love writing for kids. And even when I moved back, every time I did adult theater, I really wanted to break the fourth wall. I really wanted to have that same energy from adult audiences. And it's harder. They have, you know, I just love that most of the plays that I produce, the actors were playing, you know, bears or mice or or monkeys or something, but the kids are okay. They're like, fine, that's a monkey on stage
it's a leap. They get it,
singing and dancing, and it's totally cool. I mean, I remember like even when we were casting multiculturally in a familial unit. My adult friends were like, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't have a Latinx actor playing the mother of a Asian actor who's married to a." And I'm like, "Well, first of all, that's my family. My kid is Asian. But secondly, yes, you can. They're all birds." Right. So, but that's what
I'm going to steal that. I'm just going to steal. Yes, you can. They're all birds. I'm just going to just say that periodically.
And also, when the little Asian bird is looking up at the white mama bird and says, "Mom," the kid buys the relationship. and there's no
Totally.
questions asked. And I think that's the one thing I'm hoping to bring to this project. But I hope audiences can go back to that world, that interactive world. And it probably is something we need to investigate anyway, because who knows when it's going to be safe to gather back in large buildings. So we may need to reinvent this
No.
theatrical form.
Well, I almost wonder too, as I hear you, radio plays might allow even more of that.
Yeah.
That because it allows for more room for imagination, because we don't have set designers, right? That you can fill in
Totally agree.
how people look and what they feel like to you based on their voices.
Very exciting.
And one of the things that Mike was saying about kids is that the thing that I love about theater, a thing I love about writing in that style is you are not told how to think.
Right.
It makes you think, right? It inspires you to challenge, it inspires you to walk away and go, I think of something a little bit differently. And that's where I think this could be really successful in the conversation that we're going to have with the audience.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I mean, when you think about being in people's homes too through sound and saying, come to us as well. We want to be where you are and we want you to come where we are. Sorry, Michael, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, I'm also excited about finding where the tension is in the play. In adult theater, we write tension based on adult themes. They're big ideas. We're trying to fix major world problems. But I like theater where the problem is so minute and very specific to that character. And then the way it's dramatized is what makes it theater. I tell it when I was commissioning playwrights in children's theater, I said, you can write a whole play about a kid learning how to tie their shoe.
That's huge. That is huge. Absolutely.
Or learning your ABCs. It's a major event, and it just depends on how you dramatize it. And so I think this radio play, I think, is a moment where we have to sort of figure those things out.
I'm seeing a comment in the chat about missing Hartford's Children's Theater. So really just want to do a shout out to that, how important it is to have intergenerational theater options, right? Fiona, yeah.
Michael, you were saying about, sort of finding that tension. And I think it comes out in the oral histories, because usually at the beginning of the oral histories, the vast majority of people will tell me that this is going to be a 30-minute interview, that they don't have anything to share, that nothing much happened in their life, and then 3 hours later, I have I have one oral history. We ended up doing 11 recordings.
Wow.
Yes. God bless my graduate student who's going to help me with the transcript. But that tension, it's self-fashioning. It's like, how did you become the person that you are? How do you become the person that you are? And on the surface of it, that might not seem so deeply interesting, but when you think about like the obstacles that people had to overcome, or the opportunities that they embraced, or opportunities that maybe we wouldn't have seen as opportunities. So the play that you're writing, right, the absolute joy of Mrs. Wollaston at being at the tennis court, right? You're thinking about like the first Black public housing complex, and what comes to mind is like the tennis court, right?
Right.
Like those two things don't usually go together. But then when you get to know Mrs. Wollaston and you find out what a tremendous athlete she was, and all the different sports that she played, and that she was, she appeared in the Hartford Courant, having won championships, and she was able to, it's like save a couple of championship games, then you realize why sports were so important to her, and why that particular tennis court stood out to her when she moved into the first Black public housing complex. I think it's that the tension is self-fashioning. Like, how do you become who you are, and how did you become who you are?
But as you were saying, is what you do in your work, Fiona, you need to sometimes articulate that tension for people. You need to lift it out of their story and show them, or as we show each other, narratives that details in our narratives that elude us as we go through it.
Or lead them to it, lead
Or
them
lead them to it.
and then that should kick them in the.
I'm just going to say to all of you watching, we only have a few minutes. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. This project really grew from just this notion of family plays on the radio to really embracing this community, thanks to the insights of Connecticut Public Broadcasting, and specifically, Fiona, your work. I mean, it's really shifted it's expanded the perspective and the range of storytelling, and it's given us a focus thanks to the work of your center. So it's exciting. So Michael is our first commission. Our second commission, which I can't announce the name yet, right, because we're still working, but is a Nuyorican Puerto Rican playwright who will be sort of focusing on Puerto Rican stories in Hartford. And we're also starting conversations with a French Canadian American playwright. So we're trying to really kind of line these up, and hoping, Tim, we're sort of talking about all the different ways that we can broadcast these, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I wanted to go back to what Fiona was saying, because the thing that I love about what we're doing here is those stories won't be known by most of the people that we tell them to. These are normal people who lived in our communities, in our homes, right, where we make our home. I love the idea of keeping those stories alive and finding new ways of telling them. So that's just the way that you described her life and the simplicity of how things now seem, but back then or through her life would have been so important. So I'm really excited about that. And then figuring out how to get that to stories to people who have a like story today in a different way. I always love that when you can fast forward something like that story and have somebody relate to it. I think that's really exciting too. I'm not sure that's what you were asking.
It's a great comment. And in the chat, there's the question about timeline. Well, yes, we're in the midst. We hope to be working, really, I think, to be releasing over the summer. Summer or fall. So we promise, stay tuned to emails and postings and Seen and Heards to come, where we'll go into more detail. This is a very new project for us, and someone said to me once about running a theater is it's when you first take over a theater, it's like building the airplane while you fly it. And it's certainly been true of this last year and a half at Hartford Stage. But I would say it's also true of all these projects, right? Of artistic endeavors. You're kind of, as you start it, you realize what it is you're making. And then you kind of shift how you're making it, but you're in the middle of making it. So Mimi, I promise we will let you know. And we're working hard to make it there we go. I'm just seeing Michael's note in the chat. Yes. I wasn't going to put pressure on Michael. We're waiting for that rewrite, but there's much to do. This has really been a treat, and I'm thrilled to say that I expect this to be the first of other conversations that we'll all be having together. So I'm looking to see if there's a question in the chat where we're talking about kids being in the theater, and it's absolutely true that there's a number of plays that can bring in families and bring the kids in as well. I just feel like of late, and I don't know if you all feel this, but people are more reluctant to bring their children to the theater, to quote unquote grown-up plays. So maybe part of what this project can do is kind of shake that up, because the stories can be inspiring to young minds to want to hear more such stories and to come to the theater to join us. So we end Seen and Heards historically, and now that we've been doing this for 13 months, I think I can say historically, with communal poem readings. But this episode, we're going to end with a recorded poem reading, and then we'll all come back for our toast, our communal toast. So Fiona, Michael, Tim, I didn't warn you guys to have something to drink handy. We'll toast to this project after this reading. So it kind of makes sense, given that we're talking about recordings, that we're gonna share a recording. This is a recording of theater maker Miranda Adekoje. She's reading a poem by Elizabeth Alexander from her poetry collection, American Sublime. This is all from my memory, which is why my rhythm is sort of faulty here, but it's the poem that we recorded for our gala, for our cocktail party for our gala. That was just, I think it was a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. It's all Blurs Day. I'll take the opportunity now, right as we get the poem queued up, to thank all of you who contributed to the gala and to the online auction. And it was a tremendous outpouring of generosity from this community for Hartford Stage. But I think if we're ready, I think you'll see why we picked this poem. Yeah, so here comes Miranda Adekoje with Ars Poetica 100, I believe.
Poetry, I tell my students, is idiosyncratic. Poetry is where we are ourselves. Though Sterling Brown said every eye is a dramatic eye, digging in the clam flats for the shell that snaps, emptying the proverbial pocketbook. Poetry is what you find in the dirt in the corner, over here on the bus, God in the details, the only way to get from here to there. Poetry, and now my voice is rising, is not all love, 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 and I'm sorry the dog died. Poetry, here I hear myself loudest, is the human voice. And are we not of interest to each other?
So, ostensibly about poetry, right? But about everything we've talked about, I hope. We are of interest to each other. I ask you to raise your hand in the chat or however we do this. Yeah, there we go. Hartford Stage comes to our rescue in the chat so that we can see all your punim, all your faces for the toast. So hoping that many of you will join us. And here comes our community. This is about stories for this community and how we expand our reach. Yay. Lovely to see everybody. So welcome, welcome, welcome. And I ask you to lift a glass. Always good to have something. There we go. Fiona will toast for you. Since I didn't warn you, I apologize. I did not prepare you. So just let us say, right, that the arc of history is bending a little bit more towards justice. Much work to do, but towards the relief that was felt yesterday. And to this new project, to our partners. So really, more than anything, to Hartford Stage's extraordinary community partners. Fiona, Tim, Michael, welcome to the Hartford Stage family. And to all of you, thank you for being here with us. Oh, I have announcements. I'm supposed to read announcements and I forgot. You know, here we go. I'm skimming. This is so anticlimactic. But I'm just going to go to this. I'm just going to say the next Seen and Heard is May 19th. There are a couple of great events at the Mark Twain House that Hartford Stage is collaborating on. Shakespeare's birthday is this a week from, it's this Friday? Is it this Friday, folks? I think so. Yes, it's this Friday. So there's a wonderful talk on Emma Smith's book on Shakespeare that I get to talk to her about. And we'll do next week. We're rescheduling last night's talk on the Empathy Diaries. So join us for those. But May 19th for Seen and Heard. Thank you, new partners. Thank you, Hartford community. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Amelia.
Thanks,
Nice to
everyone.
meet
Thank you
everyone.
all. Have a
Thank you,
wonderful
everyone.
evening. There we go. And it's all in the chat. Thank you. Thank you,
Wow.
fabulous staff at Hartford Stage.
Bye
So
now. Take care.
cheers.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much for
Take care,
joining us.
everybody.
Thank you. Bye,
Be
everyone.
well.
Good night.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Mhm.